Welcome to our webinar series on participation and representation in the digital age. My name is Jenny Oser, and I'm a professor of politics and government at Ben-Gurion University. I'm also the principal investigator of an ERC project on this topic, and I'm honored to introduce our speaker today, Professor Shiro Kuriwaki of Yale University, who is a leading international scholar on the study of democratic representation. Shiro will present an article that he co-authored with Professor Stephen Ansolabehere of Harvard University that is related to their book project on representation in America. To make the most of our time, here's how we'll run this webinar. First, Shiro will speak for about a half hour. Second, I'll introduce our course panelists who prepared questions in advance about the article. And third, we'll select questions that participants submit to us in the Q&A form that we'll copy now into the chat. So during the talk, we welcome you. Send your questions through the form for the panelists' review. And a final technical note that we'll also put in the chat, if you'd like to see a written transcript of the webinar, we've enabled this feature that you can activate by clicking on your Zoom screen's bottom right option labeled More, and then click on Transcript. Thank you for joining us. And Shiro, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Jenny, for the introduction and for being here. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about our project in this great series. Let me get included here. So this is Steve Ansolabehere and I have been working for a while on multiple aspects of representation. We have a book manuscript that's currently under review that tries to ask broad, big, foundational questions about how Congress works. Namely, how well does Congress, the legislative branch, represent public opinion as a whole? And when it does not represent public opinion, which part of the process is responsible for what we call representational failure? We think this is the natural question to ask of the legislative branch that makes laws by individually elected representatives. And here in this paper, we are focusing on collective representation. That is, we're focusing on Congress as a collective body and looking at collective outcomes rather than individual roll call votes. And again, we think this is a pretty foundational descriptive question about what Congress does and how Congress reflects public opinion. But the literature, in our view, has not given a satisfying answer to this simple question. A lot of the literature that we're working in focuses in one of two other camps. So one is this idea of unequal representation that focuses on whether certain groups, like whether the high-income constituents get more representation than low-income constituents, or whether extremists get more representation than moderates. That's one camp. The other camp is what a lot of people have called dyadic representation. So this study studies individual issues or individual votes and asks whether a senator or a representative votes in the same way that their constituents in their state or in their district want them to vote. And clearly, both of these big camps are really relevant and build up to how Congress works as a collective collective body. But they are different questions. And in particular, the focus on collective representation starts with the idea that in contrast to the executive branch, for example, Congress is like herding sheep. It's taking multiple individual members and garnering a majority. And whether something passes or not seems to be of first order importance, rather than how individual members cast their vote. What party leaders seem to do is they first try to reach 50%, a majority of the votes, to get a bill passed. And whatever is beyond that 50%, the members are kind of free to vote their conscience. But getting whether something passes, whether a bill is meant to pass or whether a bill is meant to fail and voters and representatives can vote however they want, and it seems to be the first thing that we want to look at. So that's really the essence of what we're focusing on in this paper. What we do is we take public preferences on 100 or so issues from 2006 to 2022. We argue that these issues, this is a small subset of what Congress could deal with or what the public cares about, but these specific issues, we argue, approximate the congressional agenda, and specifically what Kingdon called the decision agenda. So this is the small sliver of the congressional agenda that reaches to the level at which all members of the institution are paying attention to it, rather than specific members or specific committees. And we simply trace whether these issues are passed in the two chambers of the US Congress, the House and the Senate. The top line is that among these 100 issues, 55% of them are congruent with the national majority in final passage. So either a popular bill passes or an unpopular bill fails to pass. And this particular article and part of the book is trying to unpack how that happens. Let me give some highlights of our argument, of our data, and the broader project itself. Of course, the biggest point, a big part of the project is this agenda. It's these 100 issues that we start with. This is the denominator against which we measure representation. Here are the 100 issues that are covered in our time frame. So we start with George Bush's second term that covers social issues like same-sex marriage, abortion. There are then signature issues of the administration, so of the Affordable Care Act under Obama, the tax cuts under Trump's first term, the spending bills under Biden's first term. There's also issues that reoccur from time to time, for example, repealing the Affordable Care Act, raising the minimum wage, gun control. There's also a fair number of foreign crises or financial crises, free trade agreements. We try to cover a wide range of issue domains. These 100 issues it's really important how these issues were picked. And we're going to gauge public opinion on these issues. So it's also important how we ask the survey questions from which you get the public opinion measures. So first, how do we pick these 100 issues? So these 100 issues are issues that are in this public survey called the Cooperative Congressional Election Study. And the principal investigators of this survey, which includes Steve Ansolabehere, and recently I helped with the policy questions as well, is each year, before the November of each year, we go through the news coverage of what Congress deliberated or passed, and we try to largely pick what Congressional Quarterly called key votes. So key votes in their definition are issues that satisfy all these three things. First, they are a matter of controversy. They're also a matter of political power and a matter of potentially great impact to the American public. And some of these key votes have already been voted on in one chamber or two chambers. Some of these are anticipatory that CQ thinks will be key votes. But mostly we pick issues that have been already gone through the committee process and have been voted on at least in one chamber. So one big benefit of doing it this way, instead of trying to anticipate what issues will be beforehand, is that we can write very specific questions about the final bill that reaches to the floor. So one of one example is this question that was asked in 2018 on this survey that asked, would you support or oppose the following tax bill that has these 5 features: that it would cut the corporate income tax rate by half, it would increase to kind of offset the tax cut, it would cap the amount that people can deduct from their taxes in state and local taxes, it would simplify the standard deduction, and it also cuts the income tax for all income groups by 3%. This is the Trump tax cut that was passed in December of 2017. And this is the log roll package, the compromise that came to the floor and eventually passed. Party leaders are trying to, some of these bills are single provision bills, but other big chunk are things like these that are bundles and packages that party leaders try to assemble so that the whole package passes, even though some of the provisions might be unpopular overall. We also try to, as you can see from this example, word the question so that we emphasize the main key facts in the policy, and we avoid party cues. So we're not, we don't use the word Trump in this question. We don't say this is the Republican tax bill, and we try to look at the essence of the policies that are passed in the survey and ask people binary question: would you support or oppose this bill? We argue that this is the most important and salient bills on the agenda in this time period. The one natural question is that we're over-selecting on things that are very polarized, things that have become controversial, and we're missing a lot of the uncontroversial things that glide through Congress. And to a certain extent, that's true. We're focusing on things that grab the attention of both members and the media. We're also cognizant that the agenda is chosen by the majority party. So when the majority party shifts, the agenda that we ask in the survey also abruptly shifts, depending on who controls the floor. But we also argued, and this is more in the broader book, that the agenda is a majoritarian in another respect, which is that they tend to be popular overall as well, which is maybe a bit counterintuitive. But part of this is that we ask, like, majority parties set the agenda, but we need to ask, how did the majority party become the majority in the first place? Well, in the modern era, majority parties need to have a platform and win a national election. And that majority platform, there needs to be some popular provisions, at least, for them to gain a majority. Okay. So when we take these 100 issues and show this is on the vertical axis, what's their level of national support, about a majority, about 70% of them are above water, as we say. So the majority of the public support these popular issues. On the horizontal axis here, we're showing how divisive the issue is. So comparing the survey respondents who are Democrats and the survey respondents who are Republican, and how far public opinion is between these two groups. And there are some things to the right here that are very divisive, things like impeachment and nominees and signature issues of the administration are very divisive. But there's also a lot of issues here that don't divide the public. Spending, infrastructure, as well as Free Trade Act are some of them. So, a lot of these issues are salient and controversial, although at least in the public, there are many that don't divide the public, don't divide Republican and Democratic public. This might be a good place to just position the project in the broader work on representation. So we see this work as uniting two distinct literatures in political science. One is the study of legislative process. So two of the pieces that we end up agreeing with a lot is the work by Jim Curry and Francis Lee on the limit of majority parties to ram through their agenda, and a 2011 book by David Mayhew that looks at how Congress blocks or allows presidential priorities to go through. So these focus on the legislative process and House and the Senate, which we are also interested in. But these books don't use public opinion. So there's no sense in which whether majority party priority is or a presidential priority is popular or not. Whereas we really are interested in the distinction between popular and unpopular issues. There's also the other big camp of representation is work that squarely looks at public opinion and sees whether the policy gets passed. The Marty Gillen's book on unequal representation is a model that we follow in this work. But these books largely do not focus on the legislative process. It's more of a reduced form about whether something it passes or not, whereas we really are focused on how different chambers and the internal institutional factors affect or explain final passage. So let me just focus on the main things here. These are the 100 issues, our main result is this cross tabulation. We have divide whether the survey says the issue is popular or not. So 74 out of the 103 issues are above water. And then we trace these issues to see whether that issue passes in that Congress, in the 2-year session of Congress. So we see here that about half of them pass and half of them do not pass in Congress as a whole. Among the things that are popular, about a bit more than 50%, so 39 versus 35 of them, eventually get passed in the 2 years through any legislative vehicle. It might be a up or down vote on that bill. It might be attached to a larger omnibus bill, but some way or another, these 39 of these get passed. And then there are bills that are unpopular, and more of them do not get passed rather than they get passed. And as a total, 55% of them are congruent with the national public opinion. Okay. This is a trend of how this congruence or fit measure fit runs over time. We're focusing on this black line of 2006 to 2020. There's a high point at George Bush and Obama's terms, and then it kind of dips low in Obama's second term. We also look at Marty Gillen's data, even though he has a different sample selection process that's wider than ours and it's broader. His data allow us to compute congruence or success in the same way. And roughly from 1980s to 2025, the congruence measure hovers around 40%, 60%. But we think it's roughly in this range of 55%. But we're interested in the internal legislative bargaining that goes in. So one of the places where we start is just comparing the House and the Senate. So among these 100 issues, here we're having a different cross-tabulation of what the House does and what the Senate does, whether the House passes it or not, and whether the Senate passes it or not. We also are really interested in whether there is a floor vote held at all, whether the vote is passed and it's voted down, or whether party leaders just don't bother to put it to a floor, probably because they think that it will not pass. So here we're showing the frequency of bills that land in one of these cells. And I've highlighted here the two most frequent events of our issues that require both House and Senate approval. So the most common outcome, this bottom right square here, is that both chambers do pass the bill, 42 of these, so nearly a half. But the second most frequent outcome is an issue in which the House passes the bill, but the Senate does not. And in fact, the Senate actually does not even hold a vote on the bill. So it does not appear on databases that American politics scholars often use, the roll call vote database, Poole and Rosenthal's Nominate or Vote View. Okay, so these 22 issues in our data get missed by analysis of roll call votes. And we're really interested in what are the consequences for representational success or congruence. So when we look at whether these issues here are popular or not, we get this table here. So in the red here is the number of congruence for representational success. So going to the bottom right cell, you see that above 80% of the issues that are passed are representational successes, which means that they're popular. They've passed the majority of the public. So that's one interesting number to take away here, which is that among the things that Congress passes, 80% of them have the backing of the national public. In contrast, let's look at the second most frequent cell, which is things that the Senate basically blocks. And only 13% of them are popular, which suggests that 13%, 3 out of 22, are issues that were unpopular things that the Senate, let's say, successfully blocked. And then in contrast, the vast majority of these 22 cases are popular things that the Senate decided to block. So, the Senate acts as a double-edged sword, but it blocks popular issues more than it stops unpopular issues from becoming law. We are trying to explain how this works, and another way to look at it is whether this difference in Senate action is explained by polarization or gridlock. So this is a representation or visualization that was not in the paper, but I think it's pretty useful to summarize. This graph shows the probability that the House or the Senate passes one of these bills as a function of the divisiveness of the bill. So divisiveness, again, is the difference between Republican public and Democratic public. And in the green line here is the Senate. So there's a very clear negative relationship between divisiveness and passage. Basically, if something divides Democrats and Republicans, the Senate is much less likely to pass it. And if there's bipartisan consensus, whether it's popular or unpopular, the Senate is much likely to pass that bill. And as a result, the result of both chambers follow the Senate. Interestingly, in the House, divisiveness is not correlated with passage. So which means that the House kind of just passes things whether they're divisive or not. In contrast, the mirror image is to look at this as a function of popularity rather than divisiveness. So here's the same outcome, but looking at national support. Here we see that the correlation between passage and popularity is very positive in the House. So the more popular something is, House more likely to pass it, but it is positive and not significant in the Senate. So the House passes popular things that reach at least 50% of the public, regardless of whether it's polarizing, divisive, or not. And the Senate blocks divisive things, whether it's relatively popular or not. We also look at in the paper whether an alternative explanation, which is that maybe the reason Senate is blocking things is because it has a small state bias due to its malapportionment. So small senators from small states get the same voting power as senators from large states. So we find limited explanatory power for this hypothesis. All right. The rest of this paper, a big chunk of this paper is we go through kind of case by case of these 100 issues and try to make sense of how does the individual cases inform the general pattern that we're seeing here. So from what I've just told you with the quantitative tables, we would think, I would have thought that the path towards passage is for something to be popular and not divisive, right? That's the way you get things passed in both chambers. But when we looked at the data and go through case by case, that simple hypothesis doesn't quite work out. So what I've done here is taken the points here, taken a subset of the points here, along this national popularity and divisiveness axes that I've shown before. And then we looked at kind of quadrant by quadrant how Congress works through these issues. So take, for example, the top right issues, so things that are popular and polarized. So we would expect that because they're polarized, the Senate is going to just block all of them. But in fact, 56% of them do pass and become, which are represented in the circles here. And when we look at these issues, a lot of these are cases in which the majority party used exceptions to the supermajority rule that exists in the Senate. These are sometimes called reconciliation rules for budget issues. In some instances, like Obama's first term, the Democrats had enough seats to overcome the filibuster. So there are turns out, many instances in which the majority party can circumvent the internal anti-majoritarian rules to pass something that they want. This almost kind of proves these exceptions almost prove the rule that these internal supermajority rules are important for most issues. In the bottom right, we looked at things that are polarizing but unpopular. So things that are divisive but unpopular. And in this subset, actually, here the prediction bears out, which is that almost all of these do not get passed. So things that are polarizing, but if things are unpopular, appears, at least in these 10 cases, it's very hard to pass these things. The one exception to these 10 cases is something that passed through reconciliation, again, circumventing the Senate rules, supermajority rules. Third, let's look at this bottom left corner, things that are unpopular and also not divisive. So both parties don't like it. One chunk of these issues are foreign policy issues, free trade, and security issues that are almost thrust onto the congressional agenda. So congressional leaders aren't choosing these issues. The president or external events thrust it onto the agenda, and sometimes Congress passes unpopular things. These are things like bailouts and free trade bills. And finally, a big chunk of our issues are things that are popular and not divisive. And we would expect that these are the issues that have the best promise for getting passed. But only a bit more than half of them actually pass. A lot of things that are both popular and very popular and not divisive don't get passed. And one big explanatory factor is divided government, where the minority party that's opposing the president has veto power and blocks things, even though their supporters in the public support the bill. So, this is a snapshot of what we looked at in these issues. But let me just wrap up, and then I'm happy to take questions. In the broader book project, we're really taken by work by Jim Simpson and co-authors that focus on public opinion. And Jim Simpson has this analogy of water to explain movements in public opinion. And he says that, public opinion is like a body of water, that it's usually quiet and there's a lot of inertia, but once it's set in motion, public opinion is like a tide of water that's very hard to reverse, and that affects public policy as well. We see the starting point of our project of this particular paper as what happens to that tide of water when it hits the institution of Congress. Does the institutions work as channels that amplify the majority will, or are they kind of dams that have a counter-majoritarian force? And 55% is, it's just a number, but it's a culmination of that kind of process. Overall, through the various processes that we've looked at, we argued that most of Congress, especially the electoral institutions, work as a channel. They amplify majority opinion, but the exception is the Senate. The Senate was designed to be, in part, and continues to be functioning as a dam that blocks popular issues. But more importantly, more significantly, it blocks divisive issues. And as you find the scatter plot, divisive issues are by construction not necessarily super popular or super unpopular. So they're kind of ambiguous in their public support. So the relationship between divisiveness and representational success is less clear than one might think. And then finally, you could think of, one number to take away from this paper is the 55%, but the second number to take away might be this 80% number that I mentioned, that the institutions of Congress do work as a filter such that what ends up being passed through Congress is more popular than what goes in. So with that, I'll stop there and happy to take any questions.
All right, thanks, Shiro, for this super interesting talk. And especially appreciate how you even added in new quotes and information from the article that we read. I'll now introduce our course panelists who read the paper carefully, and they'll lead the Q&A with me. And a reminder to participants, you're welcome to submit questions for our panelists' consideration through the Q&A submission form. I'll copy that again now into the chat. And as I do that, I want to also recognize we have a wonderful community of researchers who joined us today who study these topics of representation. Let us note their names and invite them to join in on the second round of Q&A. Professor Uri Kedar from Israel, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Dr. Luca Bernardi from the UK, the University of Liverpool, Dr. Marta Koznitska from Poland, the Polish Academy of Sciences, and Dr. Yael Kaplan from Israel, the Open University, all wonderful speakers we hope to invite to speak at some point in the future. So thanks for joining us. And I'll now introduce our first question, which is from Amir Marich, who is a third-year BA student in our department, and he also studies public policy and philosophy. Amir.
Okay. Thank you. And also thank you, Shiro, for your presentation. My question is, your paper discusses the stability of overtime trends, but in figure 2b, it seems that the most recent years in the dataset have a relatively low success rate that sometimes dips below 15%. Even though you didn't focus on this in your study, is it possible that this lower representational success rate in recent years might be one of the reasons current feelings of dissatisfaction with American democracy? Thank you.
And we'll do these questions one at a time, Shiro. You're welcome to answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah. You're right. In 2B and in the figure that I showed, there's kind of a dip that's roughly coincides with Obama's second term when Republicans took control of Congress. There's divided government, and in these particular cases, it's quite clear that the Republican, the minority party, took their role as a classic opposition and tried to block administration priorities that result in low representation. We do see this pattern that again in divided government, especially when Republicans have a veto point, representation is lower. And the way that presidents try to get around this is that they try to thrust things on the agenda. So Obama kind of thrust the free trade bill or various foreign policy sanctions in his second term because Congress wasn't initiating those. I think there, is that pattern that you observe there. The second part of your question was whether that explains people's dissatisfaction with Congress. And if you extend the timeline, what happens? So right after our time period ends in 2022, Kevin McCarthy gets elected speaker, and then there's much less stable Republican agenda control in the House. And I think there is a sense in which it's true that things become worse in the next Congress, although Republicans end up passing a bunch of things in the end, like the Ukraine bill in that Ukraine funding aid in that Congress as well. And so one thing is that it's kind of, people's dissatisfaction with Congress, which has been low for a while, and this kind of chaos in part in Congress. There's probably a relationship there, but also I think one thing to note is that this is partly Francis Lee's argument that what we see, what the public sees in the media about congressional dysfunction is partly the choice of congressional members to emphasize their role as opposition party or polarizing differences in party. And when for things that are not salient or things that go under the radar of the media, Congress does kind of pass things that are bipartisan, or they pass things very quickly before the media spends a lot of time on it. So we're not as quick to associate kind of recent events in the media to congressional dysfunction. If that makes sense.
Excellent, thanks. Our next question is from Shai Kadmon, a second-year BA student in our department who also studies economics.
So hi, first of all, thank you for the lecture. My question is about the study. So the study focused on whatever Congress yield an outcome that the majority of the public prefers, but do you think it might also matter how strong the public preference are? And also whether people are expressing this preference in active ways. For example, do you see value in next step research using your data that will conduct more detailed analysis of the will of the people, including the strength of people issue preference, and their political behavior, like protesting or donating money?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of great scholarship that contrasts roughly people's the mass public opinion versus other forms of participation, namely money, as different types of forces that different Republicans and Democrats treat differently. In this study, as you noted, we're treating all respondents, all public members equally. So we think of this as kind of a referendum. If the public had to vote, how would they vote, yes or no? And in referendum, it doesn't really, we're not upweighting people who have more intense preferences. We have equal weight for all members. One thing that's actually you can see in the line graph, the new line graphs, is we look at whether there's a difference between something that has 51% support versus something that has 80% support, right? That's one measure of intensity. It's how wide the support is. And the answer is, in Congress as a whole, it doesn't really matter. So you might worry that this 50% number is kind of arbitrary, or the number is sensitive to that 50% line. But we've kind of looked at when you move the 50% threshold to 60 or 70, actually the passage rate, the success rate doesn't change. There are a lot of things that the Senate blocks, even though they're very popular in the public. So the number is not very sensitive to that threshold in Congress as a whole. In the House of Representatives, we saw that there is a very clear positive relationship. So the more widespread the support is, much more likely it is to pass. But because the Senate kind of has this veto point that almost is uncorrelated with popularity, the overall line is flat, interestingly.
Very
Thank you.
interesting. Yeah. Thank you. Next question is from Rod Rifle, a second-year BA student in our department who also studies Middle Eastern studies.
So, first of all, thank you very much, Professor Shiro, for an amazing slideshow and lecture. I would like to ask you a question that has a lot of meaning personally to me. My personal connection to representation stems from the fact that I am a member of the board of the student union in our university in BGU, in Ben-Gurion University. As a registered NGO, we hold elections for our board of members annually and usually experience a tangible lack of applicants and voters, thus leading to an issue of lacking representation. From your standpoint of a researcher in the field, how would you recommend for public bodies to deal with such issues?
Lack of interest. I see. Yeah. So we're in maybe not in this particular paper, but in the broader project, we went back and read kind of how the agenda is formed in the first place, which I think is relevant to what you're asking about. There's this one traditional view of Congress is that kind of what you said. So the public is not very interested in public policy. That leaves room for narrow interest to form veto points and dictate what happens actually in the institution. This is kind of Doug Arnold's view of the logic of congressional action. And only when something explodes in the media that is when the broader public participates and Congress acts in line of what the public does. Our view in the broader project is that things have kind of probably changed since Doug Arnold wrote his book. So parties are much more disciplined now, US parties, relative to the 70s and 80s when parties are more coherent and disciplined now. So they are trying to extract things that the public cares about in order to win widespread majorities. Some of this is kind of engineered by the parties. They manufacture interest through public PR campaigns. But there's also, I think, a sense in which parties are very interested in winning a majority. So they're incentivized to pick issues that the public cares about. And then so we combine that with the idea of that discussed in Schatzsnyder, for example, that's expanding the scope of conflict. So, which is that if like the public is not interested in issues, people who have a vested interest in changing the outcome will change the scope of conflict, will pick new issues so that they can get their way. So, the broader project, we kind of see the agenda as shifting and part of a strategic process that sometimes happens to pick up very majoritarian issues. So I don't know if that exactly answered your question, but it's something that we've thought about.
Excellent. Thank you. And thanks to our panelists, our speakers for this first round of Q&A. We'll proceed to a second round of Q&A that'll include questions that have been put into the survey and students have brainstormed. But before we proceed to that, I wanted to pause and see if any of our visiting faculty might want to ask a question. Take a moment to pause. Okay, well, maybe Ori, yeah. Oh, let me see. I'm gonna ask you to unmute. You should be able to.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for an interesting talk. I hope I understand correctly, so please forgive me if I misunderstood something. I was wondering if I was just trying to wrap my head around the sort of somewhat dichotomous nature of the analysis in terms of bill passed and not passed. And I was wondering if we were to look at it in a continuous manner and think about, cases where public opinion would like to see a shift in a particular direction, and then Congress follows with a shift in that direction, but not the legislation that is particularly identical to what you trace in public opinion. In those cases, you might have responsiveness, but they would probably not get into your data set. So I was just trying to think about how that would affect the results, whether there's concern about underestimation of responsiveness, given your framework of analysis, but I might have gotten it all wrong. So thank you.
Yeah, no, that's right. I think that's a big difference between other type of work, which I think is perfectly, good work. It's kind of different approaches to study and representation. One is the spatial model of median voter is in one place, and then parties pick a position on that continuum and pass things. And I think that would have been also a great way to study this question. But in this work, you're right that we're taking a kind of issue by issue view. That's binary. That's proposal by proposal. It's kind of similar to how roll call votes work. We missed the nuance of the continuous part. But one advantage of taking the issue by issue view is that, we can plausibly say that many of these issues might not be first dimension issues. So there's things that are second dimension issues that we're capturing with our questions. Whether it underestimates or overestimates representational success, it's a good thing to think about. I would say, I think it's not immediately clear to me, because there are the binary issues that we pick are partly a product of the legislative negotiation process. So, and some of them are big changes, like Affordable Care Act and the tax cuts, but some of them are also minor changes. So there's things like there's some gun control issues in our data set that do pass. There was one kind of bipartisan gun control measure that passed at the end of our time span that was pretty modest in terms of spending for mental care and closing some loopholes. But that was a pretty small change in gun control policy. But we count it as one issue, and it's kind of weighted the same way as Obamacare, for example. So so I think there are a mix of big leaps and small leaps.
Excellent. Thanks for the question and the answer. Our next question was selected by Raz Zeno, a BA student in our department who also studies economics.
So, Shiro, first of all, thank you. It was really interesting. The answer you reach of overall 55% rate of representational success felt similar to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy answer to the ultimate question of the meaning of life. 42.
Yeah.
Could you discuss further whether you think 55% rate should be considered good rate for democracy, or whether you have in mind specific improvements that could or should be made to the American governing structure to allow for higher success rate?
Yeah, I'm familiar with the 42 number. And it turns up with some empirical regularity. So, 55% is the number in our time span, and it's roughly kind of what happens in the Gillen's data set. So turns up, but I think we ended up in a place where we say, we do not have a theoretical model that, gets 55%, and we don't have a particular theory that predicts 55%. So, I don't think it's the magic number of American politics. I think it's the distillation of a process that we think is very rich, and we want to illustrate that. And 55% is the one highlight of that. There's a glass half full, glass half empty. The question that we start with mostly in the book. I would say mostly we take a glass half full approach, which is that 55% is maybe higher than what political scientists would guess, because we're really interested in, we really studied veto points and how hard it is to get something passed in Congress. And I think the 55% number is maybe a pleasant surprise in that view. What reforms can be done to increase that number? Of course, it could be 100%. So the number is not as large as kind of views of direct democracy would want. But then, we're not sure if you should aim for 100%, right? Because even Congress is not a plebiscite, as we say in the paper. There are things that the public want that are probably not good policy. So we're not taking a view that things should be 100% either. But overall, we have this view that there's incremental positive filtering that Congress does. Things that come out of Congress are more popular than things that kind of go into that process. So that's kind of the view that we're emphasizing.
You know that David Ben-Gurion once said that the public sometimes know what he wants, but he don't know what he needs. Related to the fact that there was a big disagreement on the fact that Germany should pay rents to the Holocaust survivors in Israel. That was a big discussion about it.
Yeah,
I see.
Related to different models of representation that when we've talked about and we'll continue to talk about in the class.
Yeah, there are. So the issues that are that the public in our data tends to not like most foreign interventions, bailout, things that increase the debt spending. So the public, in these surveys don't like those things, but sometimes the public says we should just shut down the government or let the government default on its debt. And that's where this trustee model representation that kicks in, I think. But there's another way to see it in what we find in our data is that there are many instances in which Congress does not do what the public really wants. Okay, but there's actually very few instances where Congress kind of rams through something that it's really, really unpopular. So a lot of the failures that we're seeing is popular things not getting passed, rather than Congress pushing through things that are really unpopular.
Yeah, and your presentation added in the 80% end up getting passed when it's supported, and something that we didn't notice emphasized as much in the paper itself, but it really came through in the talk. So we'll transition now to our next question, selected by Shai Kadmon.
Hi. So my second question is about the conclusion during the timeline. So it seems your main interpretation and conclusion is that representation in America works pretty well overall, but we're curious to hear if you think you would reach a different conclusion if your data extended past 2022 to today, and whatever your conclusion on this question changed over the time period that you worked on analyzed data for this project. We want you to share your reflections on the fact that the conclusion of the study seemed more optimistic than contemporary political discourse would suggest.
Right. Yeah. Again, it's true that once Kevin McCarthy and tried to take the reins of the Republican Party, legislative productivity went down by a lot compared to the previous Congress. So I think if we extend the study, the number would become a few points lower. But my sense is that, I think, again, legislative productivity that we see in the media is different from legislative productivity that actually happens outside the media. And as a whole, I think that 2023 to 2024 Congress passed fewer bills, but I think that was roughly in line with what other Republican houses have passed in this 2013, 2015 period. So that tempers our expectations through what we might see. And in this current Congress, the 2025 onwards Congress, I think we also see, I think we don't want to make a judgment too quickly, because again, like at what sometimes happens is that Congress seems dysfunctional, like for most of the time, and then at the end, it slides through something that a bipartisan compromise in the end, which is kind of what happened in the Ukraine funding bill in 2023. But I agree with the sentiment that there seems to be less discipline, and also much more deference to the executive branch especially on nominees. And I think our view from this work is that Congress should have more power than less when it comes to executive relationship.
Excellent, thank you. Well, we have brainstormed and received more questions than we'll be able to answer in our time, but I do want to wrap up with one final question that came in from a couple different directions, a couple students as well. If you could speak, Shiro, we were speaking here with the international audience. The paper's data and focuses on the United States. If you might want to speak either on the basis of your prior actual empirical work or the work of others, what do you think the relevance is of these findings to other locations in general? And particularly if you might have anything to say to us about Israel, we'd be interested to hear.
Great, yeah. Not sure if I can say much about Israel, but I'm originally from Japan. So I think about the difference between Japan fairly often, and to some extent European politics. I don't know as well, again, the literature there, but I do think this process that we're documenting in American politics is largely animated by these three players, so House, Senate, and President, and that often act as vetoes, and there's an incentive for them to perform in front of an audience because they have to win elections. And I think that's one of the biggest differences from that and parliamentary system, when there's much more there's by definition unified control in this kind of efficient secret idea of unified control of the executive and lawmaking, which is not to say that there's no controversy. I think that internal party debates are under the radar more in parliamentary systems, and so I don't know what the aggregate number would be if you had a similar study in places like Israel or Japan. But I do think the things that we're seeing between divisiveness and compromise and things failing in one chamber but passing in the other are less common, and those in parliamentary systems, and that has implications for how the public perceives productivity and polarization in the legislative branch.
Excellent. Thanks, Shiro.
Yeah.
Clearly, there's more work to be done internationally.
Yeah, for sure.
As well.
Yes.
So, good. Well, thanks to our speaker and course panelists, and to participants for asking such great questions. You're welcome to join the webinar of our series that will show on a final slide. Our next webinar is with Carolina Plesia of the University of Vienna on the meanings of voting on June 4. And then on June 18, we have Chris Relazian from the University of Texas at Austin on democratic policy representation is really hard. Thanks all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you then.